So ever since so-called Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, when Trump appeared on the Rose Garden of the White House before the roses were in bloom, very much announcing a whole raft of tariffs across the world, some of which seemed completely nonsensical, and most of which were poo-pooed by economists, even those who were quite close to Trump. Ever since then, we've been on this sort of roller coaster ride of countries rushing to complete trade deals. Some of them have achieved it, some of them haven't. Some of them have compromised and bitten their lip, and others have basically said, well, this is better than we thought it was going to be. But the whole trade order has been shaken up, has been disturbed massively by Donald Trump. And actually, the response on the markets has not been as severe as many people had predicted. After the initial kind of, calamitous falls of the stock markets and the rise in the bond markets, things seem to have calmed down, and now the stock market in the US certainly is booming. And then comes round two of the trade war of Liberation Day, and in particular, something that really caught everyone's eye was the way that Trump singled out a number of countries. India was one of them. Switzerland was another with 39% tariffs, but also Canada. Canada was singled out for some very bad treatment by Donald Trump. Canada is, with Mexico, one of the two largest trading partners for the United States. So why did he do it with Canada? And why did he do it when he seemed to have got on quite well with Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, who visited him in the Oval Office the other day and was quite robust in a kind of charming way when Trump suggested that Canada might still want to be America's 51st state. Basically, Carney said, you know what, America is not for sale. And I've been speaking to some of the potential sellers, i.e. the Canadian voters, on the election campaign. So what I want to discuss now is the particular relationship with Canada, which we don't often talk about, but I think in that relationship between Trump and Canada, we sort of get an insight into Trump's psyche, and that does matter a lot. And secondly, whether the trade order of open trade, as we've known it, as many have flourished under it, whether that's finished, whether that's gone. So two guests to talk about this: Michael Ignatieff, former leader of the Canadian Liberal Party and leader of the opposition from 2008 to 2011, also very well-known author and historian, and Vicky Pryce, Chief Economics Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Let's start with you, Michael. Good morning, first of all.
Good morning, Matt. Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you. It's nice to see you as well. So what is it about the relationship between Trump and Canada that is so neuralgically vexed at the moment?
It's a great question, Matt, and Canada is trying to figure out the answer. One of the things we need to understand about tariffs, however, is that they're not just an economic weapon, they're a political weapon. Canada can live with tariffs. What it can't live is with threats of annexation. And the problem with Trump is that he's combined this kind of economic muscle stuff with kind of, really, you shouldn't exist. Really, we don't need anything you sell us. Really, why don't you become the 51st state? And that really, really angered Canadians. And it, in effect, elected Mark Carney. And so this is the thing that makes the Trump move so hard to understand. What's the balance between sheer political intimidation and economic muscle? At the moment, the key fact to remember about Canada is that we have a free trade deal with the United States, which we negotiated with Trump in 2016, and that is still valid. So he's hit us with tariffs, but most of our trade is covered by a free trade agreement, which still is holding up. The big question is what happens when they come at us and renegotiate that deal next year. Then we may be in a really, really difficult economic situation.
And of course, everything is political at the moment. And so one of the reasons, apparently, why Trump imposed 35% tariffs on Canada, having suggested beforehand that it might be less than that, is because Mark Carney followed Macron and Starmer in holding out recognition of the Palestinian state. And that is an extraordinary conflation of issues, is it not?
Well, exactly. And the globalization that we've known in the past has managed to keep politics and economics a little apart. And so we've had globalization with regimes we didn't like and all this stuff. Now Trump has put the two together in ways that are destabilizing the entire, global order. So the globalization we knew between 1989 and 2024 is over, and we're in a new world, and everybody's trying to figure out what the shape of that world will be.
If these tariffs actually go ahead, and I know that some Canadian goods are exempt from them because of the free trade agreement between Trump and the then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But if they do go ahead, how damaging would that be for Canada?
Well, we are unusually vulnerable, unusually exposed. Something like 85 to 90% of our trade is with the United States. And more than that, we do things together. We manufacture cars together, for example, shipping the car as we finish it across the border, sometimes 6 or 7 times, and that works. Now it's that sector, particularly automobiles, which is going to be savaged if suddenly the Canadian content has to pay a tariff every time it crosses the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. So that's one place where we're particularly vulnerable. We're also very vulnerable on aluminum. We produce most of the aluminum that the United States imports. If they suddenly levy tariffs, that's going to be very difficult. The long-term issue for Canada is that we are suddenly realizing what a price we pay when we have this degree of integration with the American economy. And so we need to diversify. That's the magic word. But you can't move from shipping all your lobster to Boston to shipping it to the paella makers in Spain overnight. It takes time. So we can survive, but the transition period is going to be brutal.
Well, we're discovering that with Brexit, that, if your closest trading partner geographically is someone that is, where you have barriers, it makes life a little bit more tricky because you're not going to sell those lobsters or whatever we have to sell to as easily to India or Vietnam. So, I mean, Canadian politicians keep saying that if this goes ahead, then, of course, American consumers will also suffer. But is that true? Will they suffer to the same extent as Canadians?
They will pay higher prices. They'll pay higher prices for Canadian fuel, for Canadian electricity, for Canadian aluminum, for Canadian steel, for Canadian critical minerals. I mean, we've got a lot of stuff that the United States needs, and consumers will pay the higher prices. And then the question is, what will the political blowback against Trump be when the prices start to rise at the pump, rise in the supermarkets? And nobody can tell. At the moment, the American economy seems to be absorbing the tariff costs, but I'm not confident that there isn't going to be a big blowback politically against Trump as he pursues this agenda.
Stay on the line, Michael. I want to bring in Vicky Pryce. She's the Chief Economics Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Vicky, it's good to speak to you. Is the old trade order of relatively free trade across the world, is that finished now?
Well, it looks like it is. In fact, of course, if you look back at what the US has been doing for quite some time, they have been becoming more and more protectionist, and different presidents as well. So it's not just Trump, although now it has accelerated. With Trump, he did quite a lot in his first term, and he's doing a lot more now, and that's a real problem for everybody. And indeed, if you look at growth forecasts, generally, they've been downgraded overall because of this, except the last IMF forecast, the International Monetary Fund, which came out just before the latest tariffs were announced, had actually done a little upgrade in its forecast rather than a downgrade, because he thought that perhaps the impact of the tariffs was a bit less than they had feared. And even the World Trade Organization had redone their forecast for growth of trade in the year 2025 from a fall of 0.2% to an increase of about the same number. So there was a bit of a becalming, if you like, that happened in the markets more generally, as you were saying earlier, because it didn't look to be as bad as perhaps people had feared. So it's all comparative, really, what happens in the markets. Well, now with this, of course, we've seen markets fall very significantly yesterday across the world because of that impact. And indeed, there is no doubt that going back to the sort of free trade area that we had for a while, well, it was never really free. There were always restrictions, including lots of non-tariff barriers. But we have certainly taken a huge step towards a lot more, trade protectionism than was the case before. And what I really wonder about, actually, is where is this World Trade Organization that I mentioned? I mean, a lot of what is happening right now could be seriously contested. And in fact, the Chinese have gone to the WTO contesting some of the tariffs on them. But generally, the world seemed to have agreed to have these bilateral deals and not really question some of those pressures that are being put on them, including sort of coercion. If you do this, and otherwise, I'm going to have those tariffs on there, and you have to behave in a certain way, like invest in the US and so on. It seems to be what's happening right now.
I mean, I guess international institutions are very much out of favour at the moment, and it's all about bilateral deals and with the court of King Donald in Washington. Do you think, for instance, that the European Union, and there's a very lively debate going on inside EU quarters at the moment, capitulated to Donald Trump when they accepted the tariffs that he imposed? Because once upon a time, not so long ago, the EU was laughing at the fact that Britain was the first out of the blocks with a trade deal, which EU officials were saying was far too high, and they would negotiate something much better from a position of strength as a market of 500 plus million consumers. And now they're being accused by the French government, by the Spanish government, of capitulating to Donald Trump. Who's right?
Well, yes, I don't think the deal is particularly good for the EU. I mean, they've ended up having now tariffs which are considerably higher than was the case before. So if you look at the average, about 15%, it was 2% or 2.5%. The tariffs that existed before in terms of EU exports into the US. So they certainly have ended up in a worse position with a lot of uncertainty because there is the whole area of pharmaceuticals, which still hasn't quite been decided, conflicting information coming from the US and the EU as to where we have landed on that, and there could be higher rates at some point. Steel and aluminium, not quite sorted out, because the requirement is also that one doesn't use imports of material, if you like, from China to be exempt, etc., etc. And of course, all sorts of other concessions that may well need to be made before the whole thing is finalized. Remember, this is only a framework agreement. The national governments, you mentioned France and Spain, they all have to approve it, and it may all collapse. And what will happen in the future, therefore, is pretty uncertain, including, of course, the requirement for the EU to be investing about 600 billion euros into the US and buying 700 billion worth of energy from the US. All those things which just may never happen.
Michael, I mean, Canada, I don't know, forgive me if I'm straying into cliche here, but Canada, is a geographically massive country with a relatively small population and a pretty benign kind of image around the world. You don't tend to upset people in other parts of the globe. You're international players. You get on well with Europe. You used to get on very well with the United States. Do you think that Canada, the psychology of Canada, the way that Canada sees itself is currently changing in reaction to what's happening in Washington, and in a way that could outlast this particular administration? Are you becoming a different kind of country?
What a great question. I think we're puzzling over this at home. I think there's no question this is the biggest shock to the Canadian identity, really, since the separatist crisis that we experienced with Quebec in the 90s. And I can't think of a time in which Canadians are more angry at the United States and more troubled. But let's also remember that every Canadian knows we share 5,000 kilometers of a common border. Every Canadian knows that, their brothers, their sisters, their uncles and aunts are living in the United States. We have nearly 1 million Canadians with passports living in the United States and working there. The people that you all know from Canada, like, Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and some of our great artists and singers, are all working in LA. So the integration is not just economic. There's a kind of cultural, spiritual, social integration. And when we go abroad, we look like Americans, we sound like Americans, you can't tell us apart. And yet this difference is crucial to us. And we're also realistic. We understand that if you do share a border of 5,000 kilometers, and if, you've been sharing it for 150 years, you can't reinvent your geography. You've got to live with these people. And they're the most powerful country in the history of the world. And so we're going to have to make deals that we don't like. The name of the game in Canadian identity has always been survival, and we will survive. But I can't think of a more difficult period in our national history in my lifetime, and I can't really be sure where it's going to come out. But I'm trying to put an emphasis on two things that are in tension: anger and caution on the other. And how this plays out is anybody's guess.
How very Canadian, I might say. Finally, and very briefly, Vicky, it's a bit like putting the toothpaste back into the tube. If under a new president after Trump, assuming that he leaves power, someone tried to restitch the old trade order with all its warts and everything else, do you think that would be possible, or are we in a completely new reality now? Quickly.
I think it is possible, but it will have caused all sorts of problems in between, and I think the damage will have been done, I'm afraid.
Okay. Vicky Pryce, on that sober note. Michael Ignatieff, thank you very much to both of you for coming on the programme.